Hello, and welcome to the introduction of a new seafood sustainability report entitled How Green is Your Eco Label? In 2010, the Global Aquaculture Performance Index, or GAPI, was released. GAPI is an aquaculture-specific application of Yale and Columbia University's Global Environmental Performance Index. The GAPI research program itself is financially supported by the Pew Environment Group. Today I'd like to introduce you to a new tool developed by the GAPI team here in Victoria, a comparative benchmarking analysis of marine aquaculture standards and certification schemes entitled How Green is Your Eco Label. This product is targeted as being a comparative tool and not a standard-setting initiative per se. And in light of the dynamic nature of standards and certifications, we have opted not to print a hard copy of this report, and instead we make it available in PDF format at www.gapi.ca. In doing so, before getting to the benchmarking project itself, it's worth reviewing the key elements of the GAPI approach. We initially surveyed 36 initiatives that included guidelines or metrics related to sustainable aquaculture and asked what were the major impact categories that each of these initiatives focused on. And while of course there was some variation across the pool of initiatives, we found a high degree of consensus among them. The pilot project identified 10 key impact categories that were highly conserved across the majority of the initiatives. Thus, these tended past what amounted to a peer review of key issues, thus suggesting these were the issues upon which GAPI should focus. We organized them into three general groups: inputs, discharges, and biological. Similar to a Michelin guide or a consumer report, our goal was not to measure every conceivable metric, but focus on the key priority impact areas that were identified as being most important in discriminating leaders from laggards. Next, we developed our approach to scoring environmental performance. Some existing initiatives choose to set the bar high. Others have chosen to set a lower bar. And frankly, this is nearly an impossible question to solve. There are many divergent but equally valid opinions about what constitutes good enough. However, GAPI is not a standard-setting project. Our aim is to measure on-the-water performance as accurately as possible. Therefore, we set our target to zero ecological impact, appreciating this is really an impossible goal. But that's okay because this serves as an easily defined baseline, and the distance from which provides a standardized metric of performance. The GAPI score, therefore, is a quantitative measure of the distance separating a particular player from zero impact. The greater the distance, the worse the score. Such an approach allows direct comparison of similar products from different countries, such as these two Atlantic salmon products. And this being a key innovation of GAPI, direct comparison of performance of different species, such as here we have two widely differing Asian amberjacks products which contrast significantly between each other, but also with the Atlantic salmon. While the overall score of a product is obviously important, a powerful feature of the GAPI analysis is the capacity to easily uncover determinants of performance by looking at impact categories individually, so users can see where products score particularly well or poorly relative to others. For instance, in the case of coho salmon, the most cost-efficient way for the Japanese product to increase its environmental performance would be to deal with its significant dependence on antibiotics. So, GAPI 2010 allowed us to quantify the status quo performance of major marine products, species by species and country by country. With these performances as our baseline, we are now in a position to assess labeled products. Of the 36 initiatives screened, only 20 were based on publicly available and interpretable assessment protocols. The balance lacks sufficient structure to be assessed. Among this group of 20 initiatives, 11 species fell within our decision rules for inclusion into the analysis. It is important to note that this analysis addresses only environmental performance. While some initiatives do consider additional metrics, it was necessary for us to restrict the scope to environmental performance to ensure the greatest level of consistency across the various initiatives. Further, we were restricted to interpreting the standards as they are written and presented. Finally, we were unable to assess each initiative's quality of implementation. Therefore, the overarching question addressed by the benchmarking analysis is, what is the minimum environmental performance required to meet a standard or certification? I'll now provide a brief overview of the benchmarking methodology. A much more detailed treatment, though, is available in the full report. The first step is to identify the standard setting initiative. Next, we identify what species and countries that initiative covers. Here, a hypothetical label assesses Atlantic salmon from Norway, Canada, and Chile. Focusing on Norway for the moment, we assess the performance of the labeled product in each of the 10 issue categories. In this case, the label stipulates no antibiotic use. This is zero impact for antibiotic use and thus is scored 100, the best score possible. The antibiotic score contributes 15% to the label's final score and is therefore given a value of 15. Each of the remaining 9 categories are likewise assessed. If, however, a label's criteria were to state minimum or best practice or similar language with respect to antibiotics, the lack of a clearly defined standard would result in that label receiving the same score as conventional non-labeled products of the same species from that country. The 10 weighted scores are summed to yield the Norwegian Atlantic salmon score for the label. Canadian and Chilean salmon are then likewise assessed. The final score of the 3 are weighted by each country's production volume, the weighted sum of which is 76 and is the label's absolute performance score for Atlantic salmon. This entire process is repeated again until all species and countries covered by the label and which fall within our inclusion rules are assessed. What's important in standard setting is not just the absolute performance, but how each standard drives improvement within each sector. The GAPI methodology allows us to take a label's absolute performance, which I've just reviewed, and compare that score to conventional non-labeled products to get a sense of how much improvement each label is driving. In a sense, asking, are consumers getting what they're paying for? In this example, the GAPI 2010 score for a conventional product was 70. The labeled product from the same country scores 81. Thus, the minimum value added attributable to the label is 11 points. And here are the absolute scores. Again, the overall performance of each initiative listed in descending order from top to bottom. You'll notice that 5 of the top 6 performers are organic standards. And here we have the value added scores, the magnitude by which each initiative exceeds unlabeled products. The majority of labels offer far less than 10% gain over non-labeled products, a very modest return on investment and a sobering snapshot of the state of the sustainable aquaculture movement. Again here, organics lead the way, but there's more diversity in the top third of the rankings. There's numerous insights that can be gained from these data. First of all, with regard to organic labels. Organics tend to be more ideologically driven than others, and as such, adoptability of their standards is a secondary issue. Organic labels also tend to have well-refined and predefined criteria for many impact areas. And finally, organics remains a niche product, and there remains significant economic incentive to maintain an image of quality and exclusivity. Retailer standards were problematic for us throughout this analysis. While they're reasonably abundant in the marketplace, only 2 were transparent enough to be assessed here, yielding certainly a tale of 2 retailers who chose very differently in terms of decisions that were made in building their standards. Third-party standards showed considerable variation in performance and reflect, I think, differing philosophies of the importance of adoptability. In other words, these standards together represent the differing opinions on which is a superior approach, a high-performing standard that will by its very nature exclude a high degree of production but lead by example, or a more modest standard that will be attainable by a greater proportion of producers. It's also important to appreciate the different types of information that are being conveyed by these 2 ranking systems. the absolute and the value added. Aquagap, in this case, is a good example. Because Aquagap deals with barramundi and grouper, two species whose conventional production performance is low, in the case of grouper, extremely low, there is considerable headroom to improve. And so even though Aquagap, in an absolute sense, scores relatively modestly, it's that modest score that allows considerable advancement within the value-added scores, but recognizing that even with a high value-added score, the label still does not attain a level of performance that is consistent with the rest of the pool. But from a narrowly defined, only value-added perspective, does achieve a high degree of success. GAPI was never intended to be a consumer-facing tool, but rather one that permitted direct comparisons across dimensions that were hitherto not possible. However, here we are assessing consumer-facing labels, and so we thought it important to interpret GAPI scores into a language most seafood consumers are already fluent. The red, yellow, green motif of Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Program and the Blue Ocean Institute's Guide to Ocean-Friendly Seafood. By far and away the most commonly assessed product across all initiatives surveyed was Atlantic salmon, and therefore here we focus on salmon as our main comparator across labels within the red, yellow, green motif. Our main task in this instance here was to define where the red, yellow, and the yellow-green breakpoints were for the two buyer's guides. You'll note a high degree of consistency between the two guides, with the only meaningful difference being the Seafood Watch program's slightly higher bar for reaching green. Under the Seafood Watch approach, all labeled salmon are either yellow or red. Only the U.S. National Organic Standard for farm salmon reaches green under the Blue Ocean approach. It is important to note that these scores reflect performance when viewed through a GAPI lens. Both Seafood Watch and Blue Ocean Institute have their own distinct methodology for reaching conclusions regarding the color coding of performances. Here we have estimated where the pertinent breakpoints lay in each of the buyer's guides in terms of GAPI points, and then simply layered over each label's absolute salmon performance. There are a number of higher order take-home messages this analysis illustrates. First of all, on the whole, across the sustainable seafood industry, there lacks strong and measurable performance-based standards for marine aquaculture. Performance needs to be measured to ensure return on investment. The fact only 20 of 36 labels offered structure enough to be assessed here is telling. What's more, the majority of those assessed offered very modest, if any, value added above and beyond conventional products. In all cases, initiatives turn a blind eye to the most significant of impact categories, that being the issue of scale. It is important to remember that the environment does not recognize impact per metric ton of production, but instead simply the cumulative impact of the total production. All initiatives assessed here measure performance using normalized approaches, in other words, impact per unit of production. But the environment recognizes only the cumulative effect of the total production. This was a valuable lesson from the first GAPI report, where Norwegian salmon scored a reasonable 72 points when assessed on a per metric ton basis of production. But that score plummeted to 33, among the lowest scores of all species in all countries, when the impact of the nearly 740,000 metric tons of production was taken into account. To drive the point home, here's a satellite image of the Chinese coastline. Fish farms in the strait, shrimp farms in the margins. To what degree does the per metric ton performance of this farm matter in this larger context? So while the focus of sustainability labels remains exclusively on performance per unit of production, the larger and arguably more pressing issue of scale remains unaddressed. With that, I will conclude this presentation and invite you to visit www.gapi.ca for further information. Thank you.